James Brown names 6 female singers he hates. They called him the Godfather of Soul. But behind the growls, the footwork, the blazing horns, James Brown carried a fire not just for rhythm, but for truth. Imagine a man who bled for every note he screamed, who danced not for applause, but because stillness meant surrender. Now imagine that same man watching the very sound he created, soul being softened, prettified, turned into bubblegum for mass consumption. This wasn't just artistic disagreement. This was heartbreak in slow motion. To the world, these 6 women were queens, divas of stage and voice. But to James Brown, they were symbols of everything soul wasn't supposed to become too clean, too careful, too commercial. He never launched public feuds, never dropped diss tracks. His weapon was silence, a sideways glance, a muttered phrase that carried more weight than a headline. Diana Ross. She sings soul like it's chewing bubblegum, he once said. Whitney Houston. From the throat, not the scars. Tina Turner. A dazzling mirror of his own energy, but too neatly wrapped, too accepted by the same world that once spit him out. Janis Joplin, Chaka Khan, and Mariah Carey each praised as fierce, soulful real. But to James, real wasn't technique, it was torment. It was knowing the taste of hunger, the sting of racism, the sound of your own heartbeat in an empty motel room after the crowd stopped cheering. He didn't hate women. He hated the idea of pain being marketed like perfume, of rebellion becoming choreography, and most of all of being told that someone else had perfected what he built out of blood. So why did James Brown silently resent these 6 female legends? Why did his admiration go only to those who bled like he did, like Aretha, like Lynn Collins? Because to James, soul music wasn't about being loved. It was about surviving what tried to destroy you and still daring to sing. This isn't a story about gossip. It's a truth-telling session, a peeling back of the layers beneath fame and applause. You've heard the hits. Now you're about to hear what no one dared to say. Before we reveal the 6 names that James Brown could never fully embrace, ask yourself, what is soul? Is it a sound, a look, a formula, or is it a wound you sing through? Stay tuned. The truth might just hit harder than the beat. And don't forget, like, comment, and subscribe to Legends of Black Excellence, because what comes next, no one else is willing to say out loud. Before he became the Godfather of Soul, James Brown was just a poor boy from Barnwell, South Carolina, born into nothing but dirt floors, broken homes, and the raw ache of hunger. Born on May 3, 1933, in the heart of the Jim Crow South, James Joseph Brown, Jr. entered a world that was already stacked against him. His mother left the family when he was just 4 years old, and his father was a laborer barely scraping by. With no steady place to call home, Brown grew up in extreme poverty, often sleeping in shacks, sometimes in the back of cars and at times alone in the woods. He later recalled that his family was so poor they had to bathe in a nearby creek and wear clothes stitched from old sacks. For James, pain wasn't a metaphor, it was daily reality. At 6 years old, he was sent to live in Augusta, Georgia, with an aunt who ran a brothel. The streets raised him. He shined shoes, danced for spare change, and learned how to hustle just to eat. Yet even in that bleak landscape, there was something stirring inside of him, an electric pulse. Music wasn't a dream. It was the only way out. He sang in church-banged rhythms on whatever he could find, and studied the way gospel choirs moved a crowd not with polish, but with passion. That was the foundation of James Brown's soul, not performance, but survival. In his teens, Brown was arrested for stealing a car and sentenced to a juvenile detention center. There he met Bobby Byrd, a fellow musician who would become one of the most pivotal figures in his career. With Byrd's help, Brown got early release and joined Byrd's vocal group, the Gospel Starlighters. That group soon evolved into the Famous Flames, and by 1956, they recorded Please, 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 a raw, pleading song that would change everything. It wasn't just a hit, it was a declaration. James didn't sing it. He begged it. He collapsed on stage, dropped to his knees, crawled across the floor, all while clutching the microphone like a lifeline. The spectacle was unforgettable. But more than that, it was real, and it terrified the mainstream music industry. Too wild, too black, too much. But James didn't care. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was trying to survive. By the 1960s, Brown had established himself not just as a performer, but as a revolutionary. Hits, like I Got You, I Feel Good. It's a man's world, and Papa's got a brand new bag. Didn't just showcase his sound, they created a new sound. He pioneered funk by stripping soul down to its bones, letting rhythm drive the entire arrangement. No more lush strings or background harmonies, just grit, sweat, and power. He was also a businessman, relentless, controlling, and often difficult. He ran his band like a military unit, fining members for missing cues or wearing the wrong suit. But that discipline came from trauma, from being told all his life that black men couldn't be professional, couldn't lead, couldn't build empires. So James built one from scratch. By the late 60s, he was more than an entertainer, he was a symbol. His anthem, Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud, became the unofficial soundtrack of the civil rights movement. When cities burned and communities marched, James's voice was right there, echoing their fury, their hope, and their pride. But power has a price. James Brown's rise to the top was littered with personal demons, failed marriages, volatile relationships, drug abuse, and legal battles. His temper was notorious, and his mistrust of the industry only deepened with time. He had seen too many others, especially black artists, get erased from history or exploited by the same systems that praised their work. And that mistrust shaped how he saw other performers, especially those who didn't seem to carry the same scars. For James Brown, authenticity wasn't optional. It was the price of admission. You couldn't just sing about pain. You had to live it. And that belief became a dividing line between who he respected and who he resented. He respected Aretha Franklin not just for her voice, but because she too had carried burden after burden. He admired Lynn Collins, who stood beside him through battles and breakdowns. But when it came to singers like Diana Ross, Whitney Houston, or Mariah Carey, James saw something different. He saw polish where there should have been grit. He saw voices shaped by producers, not shaped by hardship. It wasn't jealousy. It was heartbreak. He had watched soul music, the very thing he'd built with his body and blood, get softened, glamorized, and turned into a marketable product. Brown viewed the industry as a battlefield. He didn't trust those who rose without scars. That's why even as he aged and softened in some ways, his silence towards certain female icons was louder than words. He didn't curse them, but he never embraced them either. He didn't want apologies. He wanted acknowledgement that what they stood on had once been a war zone. In his final years, Brown continued performing even as his body grew tired. His hair remained jet black, his suit still shimmered, and he still danced like a man on fire. But those closest to him knew the fire was flickering. When he passed away on Christmas Day 2006, the world lost one of its fiercest voices, but not just because of the music. James Brown was the last of a breed, an artist who treated every performance like a revolution, who never faked a single note, and who refused to let soul music become something it was never meant to be. And so the question lingers, why did he struggle to embrace women who by all industry standards were legends? Because for James Brown, it was never about industry standards. It was about soul, and to him, soul had to be earned, not arranged in a studio. If you hadn't bled on stage, if you hadn't shouted from a place of real anguish, if you hadn't been denied, discarded, and still found a way to rise, then you weren't truly singing soul. It wasn't personal, it was spiritual. And James Brown's spirit would never rest easy if the music he gave his life to became just another product. To understand James Brown's rise, you have to understand this. He didn't climb to the top, he fought his way there. From the very first time he took the mic, Brown didn't just sing, he exploded. His rise wasn't quiet or calculated. It was a sonic riot, a dance of defiance and an unrelenting roar from someone who had been silenced for too long. Long before the world knew his name, James knew that his voice had to cut through systems designed to ignore him. He didn't have record deals or endorsements backing him in the beginning, just rhythm rage and an iron will. His breakthrough came with Please, Please, Please in 1956, a raw ballad filled with desperation and soul. The record label didn't know what to do with it. His vocal cracked, he moaned too much, it didn't follow the formula. But the streets loved it. So did the black community. That record sold over 1 million copies, and Brown was suddenly on the map. But success didn't soften him, it made him hungrier. Unlike polished Motown acts, Brown refused to be molded. He didn't want to be softened. He demanded total control of his music, his shows, his sound. In the late 50s and early 60s, while other artists allowed producers to handle arrangements, Brown took the wheel. He pushed his band to extremes, drilling them endlessly, until every horn hit every drum kick was a weapon of precision. His live shows weren't just performances, they were battles. Audiences were stunned. Brown would drop to his knees mid-song only to be revived by a cape and return even more ferociously. He sweated through every suit left the stage, gasping, collapsed in dressing rooms, then demanded to do it all again the next night. His devotion to performance was nearly masochistic, but to him anything less would be a lie. In 1963, he recorded Live at the Apollo, a self-funded gamble that became one of the greatest live albums in history. The label didn't want it. They said live records didn't sell. Brown knew better. When the album dropped, it shattered expectations and sold millions. More than that, it became proof that raw, unfiltered, unapologetic soul could dominate the market without compromise. The 60s marked the golden age of James Brown's fame. He wasn't just a star, he became a force. Songs like Papa's Got a Brand New Bag, I Got You, I Feel Good, and Cold Sweat didn't just chart, they reshaped the landscape. He stripped R&B down to its core elements, shifted emphasis from melody to rhythm, and pioneered what would become known as funk. His sound was minimal, but powerful, repetitive yet hypnotic. It forced your body to move. By 1968, as America was reeling from the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr., and Malcolm X Brown stepped into an even greater role. Say It Loud. I'm Black and I'm Proud wasn't just a hit. It was a cultural revolution. While some black performers still hesitated to speak on race for fear of losing crossover appeal, James stood firm. He embraced his roots, challenged white audiences to meet him where he was, and gave a voice to the anger and pride boiling in Black America. It was during this period that Brown's name became synonymous with both power and rebellion. But fame brought enemies. He clashed with promoters, radio stations, and even fellow artists. Many saw his confidence as arrogance. Others felt he was too controlling, but few could deny his genius. He pushed the boundaries of the genre, creating a live experience that was equal parts sermon and war cry. He was dubbed the hardest working man in show business, and not just as a compliment. His work ethic bordered on obsession. Band members feared missing cues, being offbeat, or showing up late. They knew James would find them on the spot. But it wasn't just about the music, it was about the principle. James believed that if black artists wanted to be taken seriously, they had to be 10 times more prepared, 10 times more disciplined, and 10 times more fearless. This militant approach earned him both admiration and resentment. He used his fame for influence. After the assassination of MLK in 1968, it was James Brown who appeared on television, urging black communities not to riot. In cities like Boston, where unrest was feared, his televised concert is credited with calming tensions and preventing violence. His reach extended far beyond the stage into politics activism and cultural transformation. By the 1970s, James Brown was a full-fledged empire. He had his own record label, radio stations, and even appeared in films. He was no longer just a singer. He was a mogul. But with that rise came internal conflict. The music industry was shifting. The polished pop soul of Motown was dominating the charts. Diana Ross. The Supremes and later acts like Whitney Houston were becoming the new faces of black music, more refined, more commercially safe, and more acceptable to white audiences. Brown saw the writing on the wall. His raw sound, once revolutionary, was being replaced by smoother production and safer themes. He watched as black music was diluted for mass appeal, stripped of the rage and resistance he had fought to inject into it. And this is where the seeds of his quiet resentment began to grow. He didn't hate Diana Ross personally, nor did he publicly feud with Whitney Houston or Tina Turner. But he couldn't ignore what they represented to him, a generation of black artists who didn't have to fight the same wars, who entered the stage through doors he had to break open. They were celebrated for the very things he was once punished for. To him, their success felt like a warning that soul was no longer a battle cry, but a product. Something wrapped in glitter, sold through perfume ads and tailored for white acceptance. Brown, who had faced poverty, racism, and industry sabotage, looked at this new era with deep suspicion. He still performed through the 80s and 90s, even as funk lost its commercial edge. Younger artists sampled his work, built hip-hop atop his drum breaks, yet rarely acknowledged his full impact. He watched from the shadows as black music moved on smiling faces, pop melodies, and brand deals replacing raw rebellion. Even as he aged, Brown's fire never dimmed. He never softened his stance on what soul meant. To him, it wasn't a genre, it was a wound, a scar that bled melody. And you couldn't replicate that with studio tricks or PR campaigns. He was knighted by the industry, yes, but not without bitterness. Because the very system that once tried to erase him now praised artists he believed had sanitized his legacy. He didn't want validation. He wanted justice for the pain that shaped his sound, for the fight that birthed funk, for the soul that couldn't be sold. That's why when people spoke of new queens of soul, his silence was deafening. Because James Brown never wanted to be worshipped. He wanted to be remembered, not for the suits, the spins, or the screams, but for the truth that shook through every beat of his music. That soul was survival. For all the spotlight James Brown commanded on stage, the darkness behind it grew just as powerful. His fire may have lit arenas, but in private, it often scorched everything in its path. James Brown's life was a paradox, one of unmatched brilliance and painful contradictions. As the Godfather of Soul, he broke barriers no black artist before him dared to touch. But with power came paranoia, and with fame came a deepening sense of betrayal, not just by the music industry, but by the very world he tried to uplift. By the mid-1970s, Brown's iron grip on his career began to fracture. His bandmates left in waves, citing his obsessive control, erratic behavior, and abusive discipline. Some said he fined them for missed notes, others for stepping out of sync. Behind the mic, he was a god. But behind closed doors, he was unraveling. His mistrust ran deep. He believed that black artistry, his artistry was being co-opted, commodified, and made more palatable for white consumption. While he was fighting for cultural power, others were turning soul into a commercial slogan. Diana Ross's poise, Whitney's perfection, Mariah's polish. He viewed these not as evolutions of his legacy, but as distortions. And he could not reconcile with a world where his sweat was traded for sparkles. That bitterness festered. By the 1980s, Brown's personal life began crumbling. He was arrested for domestic violence, drug possession, and brandishing firearms. His rage, once channeled through rhythm and protest, began to bleed into his relationships. His third wife, Adrienne Rodriguez, accused him of physical abuse. At one point, he faced assault charges in multiple states. He denied many of the claims, but the scars they left on his legacy were undeniable. He became a caricature in the eyes of the media, wild-eyed, ranting, unstable. The same industry that once feared his political power now laughed at his erratic interviews. But those who had known him for decades knew better. James wasn't crazy. He was tired. tired of being the original, only to be left behind by the copies. Tired of watching soul music transformed into glittered trophies and sold by artists he believed never knew real struggle. There was a moment in 1988 that encapsulated it all. After a high-speed chase with police, James Brown was sentenced to 6 years in prison for aggravated assault and failing to stop for officers. The mugshot went viral before viral even existed. The man who once screamed, "I'm black and I'm proud," now sat behind bars, his reputation in tatters. The system had cheered him on stage, then caged him backstage. But the worst betrayal of all came in the years that followed the silence. As new generations of singers rose, Brown found himself increasingly ignored. He heard his beats sampled, his voice echoed in hip-hop hooks, his footwork mirrored by pop stars. Yet his name was often missing from their interviews. He wasn't bitter toward the art, but toward the erasure. Funk had become fashionable, yet its father was fading from view. And still he performed. Even into his 60s and 70s, James Brown danced as if time had no grip on him. But age wore him down. His health declined, diabetes, prostate cancer, and complications from years of hard living took their toll. He was hospitalized multiple times in the early 2000s, but each time he bounced back. Or at least tried to. On December 25, 2006, the man who made Christmas albums and filled stadiums with joy died alone in a hospital room in Atlanta. The official cause, congestive heart failure resulting from pneumonia. But many didn't believe it was that simple. In the days following his death, close friends, former associates, and even medical professionals began whispering that something wasn't right. Brown had walked into the hospital under his own power. He had joked with nurses. Hours later, he was dead. His longtime manager, Charles Bobbitt, was the only one with him at the time. Bobbitt later claimed James simply uttered, "I'm going away tonight," before dying. Yet others saw inconsistencies. Brown's daughter, Dr. Yama Brown, expressed deep unease with how quickly his body was embalmed. Others noted that no autopsy was conducted. In 2019, CNN conducted an extensive investigation interviewing over a dozen people who believed Brown's death should be reopened. Some alleged foul play. One informant claimed he had evidence of a murder involving drugged drinks and forged hospital records. To this day, no criminal charges have been filed, and the case remains clouded in uncertainty. But the mystery of his death is matched only by the complexity of his legacy. James Brown wasn't just a man. He was a force, flawed, fiery, and fearless. He could electrify a stage and destroy a friendship in the same breath. He could preach empowerment one minute, then rage at a world that refused to understand him the next. And when it came to the 6 women he never embraced, it wasn't hatred, it was mourning. Mourning the soul he believed had been lost in the glamour. He couldn't forgive a world that praised sugar-coated pain while ignoring the voices that came from the gutter. To him, every high note sung without scars was a betrayal of the fight he endured. So no, James Brown didn't die peacefully. He left with questions unanswered, battles unfinished, and a heart still bruised by the sounds he once owned being filtered through voices that never knew the war. But one truth remains undeniable. James Brown didn't just make music. He made history scream. He never raised his voice to the 6 women, never confronted them on stage, never started a war in the press. But James Brown's silence toward them, it echoed louder than any scream. Tina Turner, Diana Ross, Whitney Houston, Janis Joplin, Chaka Khan, Mariah Carey. They were radiant, powerful, iconic. But to James Brown, their presence in the spotlight came at a cost. He couldn't accept the dilution of the very soul he had bled for. He didn't hate them as people. He didn't deny their talent. What he saw was something deeper, more painful. He saw the fire of soul music cooled into something glossy and controlled, something marketable, digestible, and safe. He saw a world where voices like his had to claw their way out of poverty, scream through racism, and fight for every second of airtime, only to watch others step into the industry he helped build without ever knowing that fight. That wound ran deeper than competition. It wasn't about ego. It was about erasure. James Brown didn't just want to be remembered. He wanted the soul of the music, his soul, to be remembered. He believed true music wasn't born from beauty but from brutality, from hunger, from rage, from sleeping on bus benches and shouting into broken microphones until someone finally listened. And if a voice hadn't known that kind of darkness, he couldn't believe in its light. But here's the tragedy. The very women he held at arm's length, they too had scars. Tina Turner endured unspeakable abuse. Whitney Houston fought her demons until the end. Diana Ross carried pain behind perfection. Yet James, hardened by survival, struggled to see those invisible wounds. He mistook polish for privilege. That's the complexity of James Brown. He was a man of vision and of blind spots. A man who built the house of funk, then bristled when others redecorated the rooms. A father of soul who couldn't always accept its evolution. And maybe, just maybe, his silence wasn't rejection. Maybe it was grief. Grief that what he made from pain could one day be performed without it. James Brown died as he lived, uncompromising, raw, and misunderstood. But his music remains. So does the fire he ignited. Now it's up to us to remember what he stood for and what he stood against. If you believe that soul music is more than sound, that it's a truth, a scream, a survival story, then share this story. Talk about it. Disagree with it. Feel it. Because whether you sing from your scars or from your stage, the legacy of James Brown will always ask one question. Did you live it? Like, comment, and subscribe to Legends of Black Excellence. Because here we don't just tell the stories, we unearth the soul behind them.